Good afternoon, and welcome to the Leavenworth Series, A Military History of the Cold War. And I think many of you, I think you understand that it has been just an unbelievably wonderful series as well. We are honored this afternoon to have Dr. James Willbanks with us. Dr. James Willbanks is the General of the Army, George C. Marshall Chair of Military History, and Director of the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas. He is a retired Army officer with 23 years of service in various infantry and staff assignments, to include a tour as an advisor with a South Vietnamese infantry regiment during the 1972 North Vietnamese Eastern Offensive. He holds a BA in History from Texas A&M University and an MA and PhD in History from the University of Kansas. He is the author of several books on the Vietnam War, to include Abandoning Vietnam, The Battle of An Loc, and the Tet Offensive, A Concise History. He is also the editor of America's Heroes, Medal of Honor recipients from the Civil War to Afghanistan and the Vietnam War, a volume in the International Library of Essays on Military History. Dr. Willbanks is a trustee of the Society for Military History and is on the History Advisory Committee of ABC Clio Publishing and serves on the editorial board of Vietnam and Armchair General magazines. He is one of the most respected operational historians of the Vietnam War. This afternoon, he will address Vietnam 1968 to 1975. It is with pleasure that I present Dr. James Willbanks to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Most kind. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming here. This is the second Vietnam lecture in this series. The first was done last month by my colleague, Randy Mullis from our department, and he covered the first part of the war. And my task here, and not enough time, is to cover the rest of the war, but we'll give it a shot anyway. Let's start with the situation in 1967. We had been on the ground with U.S. combat troops since March 65 when the first Marines went ashore. So by 67, we have an increasing U.S. troop commitment that will reach over 500,000 troops by April 1969. Commensurate number of casualties are rising as well. The strategy from MACV, the headquarters in Saigon, is focused on attriting the enemy in as large a battles as can be accomplished on the battlefield. At home, there is waning enthusiasm even among those who support the war, and the anti-war movement continues to grow. Politically, Johnson was beset within his own party by challengers. Consequently, he set about, toward the end of 1967, to launch what he called, or was called, a success campaign, to show that there was being some progress in the war in Vietnam. As part of this campaign, he brought General Westmoreland home from Saigon, and in a number of venues, Westmoreland espoused his opinion that the end was coming into view, that there was some light at the end of the tunnel. Now, taken at face value, this appears to be somewhat egregious. However, based upon his metric, he's perhaps telling the truth from his perception, because in the battles of 66 and 67, the other side is sustaining heavy casualties on the battlefield in battles like Dak To, Song Bay, Con Tien, Loc Ninh. But what's going on in the latter part of 1967 is that the other side is conducting what we would call today in our doctrine shaping operations. Because as these operations are happening in the second half of 1967, the North Vietnamese are planning the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive, the opening shot of the Tet Offensive is really 21 January at Quai Son. Tet Offensive itself begins on 30 January because about half of the troops don't get the word. It turns out they're using two different lunar calendars. So there are some preemptory attacks up north. That gives the Americans some warning, but it doesn't help with the South Vietnamese because of the Tet holiday. Most of the ARVN soldiers have gone home. as is their custom on the Tet holiday, which is normally a time of truce. The offensive strikes with a vengeance on 31 January, and these are very splashy attacks, and all of you who saw the news remember them. 15 sappers inside the grounds of the U.S. Embassy, massive attacks by 5 BC battalions in Cholon, the Chinese section of Saigon. 10 battalions attack Hue, the old ancient capital. And these are evocative images. And these images fly in the face of what Westmoreland has already said, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm sure most of you who lived through this remember these images and can relate to the impact that they had on the American public. The military results are somewhat different than those images would give you the impression. After the U.S. forces, the ARVN and the other allies overcame the initial surprise, they overwhelmed the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and most of the rest of the battles. And these battles continued up into the fall. The Tet Offensive, the initial offensive that is most popularly known, is really kind of the first phase of the Tet Offensive, and there are successive phases that extend up into September and October. You can see the losses there. Perhaps the most telling one is the one in red. The People's Liberation Army and the PAVN, but primarily the Viet Cong, sustained over 40,000 killed during these actions. A large number of South Vietnamese civilians are killed because most of the fighting is inside the cities. Now this is, in terms of sheer military numbers and casualties, the victory belongs to the Allies. It doesn't quite turn out that way, obviously. Johnson is stunned by the scope and the ferocity of the attack, announces he will not run for re-election. In August, a very contentious Democratic National Convention in Chicago in which Humphrey wins the Democratic nomination. Meanwhile, in Miami, Nixon wins the Republican nomination, takes Agnew as his running mate, hints about a secret plan to win the war, and talks about peace with honor. Ill-defined, but talked about nonetheless. In the election, Nixon wins, but just barely. Now here's the situation in early '69 when Nixon takes office. The anti-war movement continuing to gain velocity. Even the hawks are beginning to wonder what we're doing because there seems to be no progress in the war, and the credibility gap widens on a daily basis. Meanwhile, corruption within the South Vietnamese ranks continues, and by April '69 we have over 500,000 troops there. Nixon's strategy that was developed in the first couple of months really takes a kind of a four-part approach, which we'll call peace with honor, for lack of anything better to call it, that will involve Vietnamization, pacification, troop withdrawals, and the Paris peace talks. And the troop withdrawals and Vietnamization are announced at the Midway Conference with President Tu on June the 8th, 1969. And at that particular point, Nixon says the war will be transferred over to the South Vietnamese, and U.S. troops will begin to be withdrawn. The U.S. troop withdrawals, announced in June, began in August with a brigade from the 9th Infantry Division. 15 increments would follow, supposedly predicated on what was going on the battlefield and how Vietnamization was going. Once they started, however, they achieved a momentum of their own. And in fact, the troops were continuing to be withdrawn even when we were in the middle of the Easter Offensive of 1972. So when I was in An Loc up against the Cambodian border in April and May, there were troops 65 miles away getting on airplanes and going home, which was a bit disconcerting from a personal standpoint. The Paris peace talks, the peace talks that opened in '68 went nowhere. They spent almost a year talking about the shape of the table. So those talks were not going to result in anything. So Kissinger, at Nixon's direction, approached Le Docteau, and they began to meet in a villa outside of Paris in August of '69. And it is these talks that will ultimately result in the Paris Peace Accords. Pacification had been an ongoing effort since the beginning of the war, but it was pretty disjointed until 1967, when the Accords program, as shown on the slide, was established. And the objectives of the Accord program was basically to spread the influence and control of the Saigon government in the countryside. In the years after the Tet Offensive, because the Viet Cong were so damaged during the Tet Offensive, there are some inroads made in this particular area. In the end, it turns to be superfluous anyway, because it's not guerrillas that win the war in April 75, it's guys driving tanks. Vietnamization itself really was a four-part effort. Increase the size of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, modernize them in terms of equipment, partnership them with the U.S. units, and improve the advisory effort. The advisory effort had been going on since 1950, even during the first Indochina War. But frankly, the advisory effort had become a sideshow once the U.S. units began to arrive in country in March of '65. Now, as we begin to withdraw our troops, the importance of the advisory effort begins to come to the fore again. The objective of all of this is turn the war over to the South Vietnamese as the U.S. troops are withdrawn. Those who are charged to do it are the three that you see on this slide. General Abrams, Creighton Abrams, MACV commander who took over from Westmoreland in mid-68, Ambassador Bunker, and Colby. Colby was the head of the pacification program, the Accords program, William Colby. These are the three individuals, the three senior folks, American folks in Saigon. To make this all official, MACV receives a mission change on 15 August 69. The mission for MACV goes from defeating the enemy to providing maximum assistance to transfer the war to the South Vietnamese. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. Number one, the other side gets a vote. And the other side's going to continue the pressure on the battlefield. So Abrams is going to try to have to hold off the enemy to provide time for pacification and Vietnamization to work, while, by the way, withdrawing U.S. troops almost every 4 or 5 months. And this becomes an imponderable problem. The war is going to continue. You have a Tet in '69, the Battle of Hamburger Hill, a very contentious event in the summer of '69, a battle that results in a tremendous amount of U.S. casualties as well as casualties for the other side, in which Ted Kennedy, on the floor of Congress, lambasted MACV for taking on these kinds of operations while the U.S. are beginning to withdraw troops. The fact that the war continues is pointed up that 1969 was the third highest annual total of U.S. killed in action for the war. So the war decidedly is not over. In 1970, Nixon announced that U.S. and South Vietnamese troops are going to go into Cambodia. Militarily, this makes sense because Cambodia had been the base areas in what's known as the Parrot's Beak and the Fishhook were long-time sanctuaries for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And the idea was basically to go into these areas, which were logistics base camps, and destroy those so that we would have time, or that the U.S. forces would have time to increase the combat capabilities of the South Vietnamese. As I said, militarily it makes sense. Politically, it results in a firestorm. Kent State shootings on 4 May, 9 May, 100,000 march on Washington. 10 May, 2 students are killed by state police at Jackson State. 500 campuses shut down, and then there is a flurry of legislation trying to limit the powers of the executive branch to promote the war in Southeast Asia. The Cooper Church Amendment is particularly important because it prohibits U.S. ground troops on the ground in Laos and Cambodia. And that will be important in 1971, as I'll show you here in a bit, timely as it may be. In 1971, trying to do the same thing that was done in Cambodia, Nixon orders an incursion into Laos along Highway 9, which is adjacent to Khe Sanh, up north just south of the DMZ. The idea was the same. There were 4 major base camps along this highway. And the idea was to take these base camps out so that we could continue to build those forces in the north, the South Vietnamese forces. Because of the Cooper Church Amendment, no U.S. forces could accompany the South Vietnamese forces across the border. So that means in this case, unlike Cambodia, they attacked without their U.S. advisors. We did provide artillery and helicopters and tactical air support. In this particular operation, which I happen to be have a manuscript now at Texas A&M Press on this campaign, South Vietnamese do reasonably well the first couple of weeks, and then President Tu tells them to slow down because he's worried about casualties, and the North Vietnamese respond very quickly by running multiple divisions in there, and the enduring image is the South Vietnamese being pulled back into Vietnam doing chin-ups on the Huey skids. Now, it wasn't quite as bad as those images portrayed, but it still was pretty bad. It showed that the South Vietnamese were still a work in progress at this juncture. So the situation by the end of 1971, U.S. troop strength is down almost below 100,000, depending on what particular day you're talking about. The U.S. troops that are left in the field, the morale is down. The saying was, who wants to be the last guy killed in Vietnam or going home anyway? U.S. advisory effort continues, but it's being downsized at the same time that the U.S. troops, the combat troops, are being downsized. The South Vietnamese forces are trying to recover from Lam Son. This was a blow to not only their ego, but to their whole ideas about what kind of force they were. While Lam Son proved to the South Vietnamese that they were a work in progress, it proves to the North Vietnamese that now might be the time to get a little bit more adventuresome. And so they make plans to conduct a new offensive. Back here. There are a number of reasons why they decide to launch this new offensive. The first reason is to defeat the South Vietnamese armed forces, to threaten Saigon directly, destabilize the Saigon government. And this is interesting, to defeat Vietnamization and pacification. I have several documents, some that were in Russian, some that are in Vietnamese, that talk about the fact that pacification is beginning to work in the countryside, and that Vietnamization is having some success as well. So there is the idea that if we can launch this now before the South Vietnamese get any better, it's so much to the good for Hanoi. And there was always the idea to fracture this resolve and partnership between the U.S. and the Republic of Vietnam. And there is always a political component to every military movement within the North Vietnamese approach to the war. It's called Dao Tron, the struggle. Every event has a political component and a military component. And in this particular case, the military component is pretty clear for the 1972 offensive. The political component is if you don't win, then you're better positioned for any follow-on negotiations. And as it turns out, that works pretty well for them. The Windway Campaign, as it was called, was a massive undertaking for North Vietnam. Every division in the North Vietnamese inventory, less two, one that stayed in North Vietnam and one that stayed in Laos, came south. 3 major attacks. First one at Quang Tri at the north, just below the DMZ. These are multi-division attacks. In this case, for Quang Tri, it was almost 5 divisions. Kon Tum in the Central Highlands. That's actually An Loc in Military Region 3, and then Kon Tum in the Central Highlands. Plus, there were some pinning attacks in the Mekong Delta. And the idea was to focus these attacks, in each case at least 3 divisions, on the 3 main targets of Quang Tri, Kon Tum, and An Loc. I happen to be at An Loc as an aside. 14 divisions, 26 separate regiments, 120 to 130,000 troops. This is as far as you can get from an insurgency as possible. These guys are driving tanks. They have anti-aircraft guns that fire up to 16,000 feet. They have shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missiles. They have anti-tank rockets and missiles. So they have the latest in Soviet and Chinese equipment, and they're coming south as quickly as they can. Nixon's response is pretty immediate. Increase the air assets in theater, almost double the size of the B-52 fleet, which was located in Thailand and Guam. Launch Linebacker 1, 40,000 sorties, a sortie being a takeoff and a landing. Mined Haiphong Harbor with Operation Pocket Money. And the purpose of that, obviously, was to stop the ships from China and the Soviet Union of offloading all those munitions and material in Haiphong Harbor. Almost double the size of the 7th Fleet, and went to 6 carriers, which was extremely important because each of them carried over 100 aircraft. And that would be important to allow the South Vietnamese to turn back the Easter Offensive. Bitter fighting from north to south went on from March until September. The operation started on Good Friday, 31 March 72, and in the process, early on, in May, Quang Tri fell to the North Vietnamese. They overran the city. By September, the South Vietnamese had gone back in and retaken Quang Tri. The fighting was extremely bitter. My regiment started out with 1,100. We ended up with 350. And most of us had been wounded at least once. The pictures on the bottom there are, actually all of those pictures are from An Loc and sort of reflect the level of combat. And this is representative of all three of the major battles. The bottom line is that after this fighting is over, and it's a very near thing, there were 3 major attacks, for instance, at An Loc, and in each case they almost succeeded in overrunning the town. Kon Tum holds in the Central Highlands. An Loc in Military Region 3, 65 miles away from Saigon, holds, and Quang Tri is recaptured in September. As you might expect, the South Vietnamese morale was pretty high. Nixon touts the success of Vietnamization, and this will provide the rationale for increasing the troop withdrawals and for ultimately the total U.S. pullout. The story, however, is a bit more complicated. It is true that the South Vietnamese held in An Loc and Kon Tum. It is true that they retook Quang Tri. It is also true that the advisors played a major role and that U.S. air power played a major role. So this was the rest of the story, but the rest of the story really wasn't part of the story. The story was the South Vietnamese had defeated North Vietnam and we could go home. Those of us on the ground were proud of what the South Vietnamese had done, but we also knew that it had been done with a large amount of U.S. air power that had made the difference in the long run. The peace talks are ongoing, and it's kind of interesting if you look at the peace talks. Kissinger says that in April and May, when the North Vietnamese are riding the high tide of victory, that all they do at the villa outside of Paris is read him stories out of the Paris newspaper saying how the North Vietnamese are winning the war. However, when the dynamic changes, and it happens, for instance, June 18th, President Tu lands in An Loc and promotes the general in charge and gives out medals and leaves. But that is sort of the indication then that that battle largely is over. It's not totally over. At that particular juncture in the late summer, the North Vietnamese come a bit more malleable at the negotiating table. But the real problem for Kissinger is he has no bargaining power, because the only bargaining chip he has is U.S. troop withdrawals, and we're already doing that. So he's going to a poker game with no chips. Or if he arrives with chips, he said, please, just take them. So there is some progress made, though, because the North Vietnamese are so beat up during the Easter Offensive. On 14 August, they, for the very first time, acknowledged the legitimacy of the Saigon government, a major concession. Shortly thereafter that, Kissinger and late October, the North Vietnamese negotiator, returned home for consultations. 26 September, they propose a provisional government of national accord, which sounds like a coalition government. Haig is sent, General Alexander Haig, Kissinger's assistant, is sent to Saigon to meet with President Tu. As you might suspect, President Tu is not too particularly excited about the way things are going in Paris. He smells a sellout. Kissinger goes to Saigon to confer with Tu in October, and essentially what they're trying to convince him to do is to agree to that what is developing is the Paris Peace Accords, ultimately result in. North Vietnam's Pham Van Dong announces that Hanoi will accept a ceasefire in place. Well, of course they will. We had gone into the negotiations, and one of our objectives, one of Nixon and Kissinger's objectives, was a mutual withdrawal of forces. U.S. forces would withdraw. North Vietnam would pull back north of the DMZ. Well, if we go back to my original slide where I told you about the objectives, the idea is to put yourself in a better place for negotiations, and a ceasefire in place does that. Now, at this particular juncture, it's not significant in terms of troops. For instance, there were 3 divisions that attacked An Loc, and during the course of April, May, and the first part of June, those 3 divisions were decimated. But the remnants of those units are still there in the jungle right outside the town. Both sides are so exhausted that neither can push each other around at that particular point. President Tu, as you might suspect, rejects the proposed accord, which calls for a ceasefire in place and a coalition government. He's pretty prescient because he realizes that in a coalition government, ultimately he's going to lose out. Nixon orders end of bombing north of the 20th parallel. Tu broadcasts a renunciation of the ceasefire agreement. Then Kissinger, making Nixon very angry, goes on TV and announces that peace is at hand. He just forgot to talk to the other parties. President Tu, shortly thereafter, denounces the draft peace treaty as a surrender of the South Vietnamese people to the communists. Xuan Thuy, one of the other negotiators in Paris, actually a representative of the National Liberation Front, or by this time the Provisional Revolutionary Government, announces that the peace process is being held up due to the U.S. lack of seriousness. Hanoi announces that its forces will increase fighting on all fronts. We go back to Tu in Saigon to try to convince him to agree to this agreement. And I think he realizes, it's clear that he realizes that this is not a very good deal for the Republic of Vietnam. So he submits 69 amendments to the draft agreement, of which Kissinger says he feels bound to take back to Paris. By this time, Kissinger is extremely frustrated. And you excuse my language, but basically he says they're both shits, both sides. The secret talks then bogged down during the latter part of November. The first part of December, the talks resume. And on 13 December, the North Vietnamese return to Hanoi for consultations. At that particular point, Nixon says, enough of this. He launches Operation Linebacker 2, target against Hanoi and Haiphong. And the objective was to force the Vietnam back to the negotiating table to sign the Paris Peace Accord. On 26 December, the North Vietnamese do agree to come back to the talks. 29 December, Linebacker is terminated. The results are as shown on the slide. As you might suspect, Nixon is vilified for carpet bombing North Vietnam, to include being castigated by the Pope, among other folks. Very short, very quickly, and very quick action. And oh, by the way, at the end of Linebacker 2, actually about 4 days before the end of the Linebacker 2, North Vietnam is completely and totally on the ropes. They have no more SAM missiles to put on the rails. They are at the disposal of the United States. I suggest that perhaps there was an advantage there, but it was not pressed because I would submit to you that Kissinger and Nixon had already decided we were going to sign the Paris Peace Accords regardless. And that is pointed up by the fact that the Paris Peace Accords that are signed on 23 January 73 is the same agreement that had been agreed to in October before the bombing. So the question is, what was the bombing all about? And the supposition is that it was to send a message to Tu that Nixon would respond if the North Vietnamese launched another major offensive after the signing of the Paris Accords. The provisions are as shown there: a ceasefire in place, U.S. to cease all military operations against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a withdrawal of all U.S. forces within 60 days, and a repatriation of all POWs on both sides. And the U.S. would contribute to healing the wounds of war and to post-war reconstruction of the DRV. I point out again, this is essentially the same agreement in large part as had already been agreed to before Linebacker 2 was launched. The key thing about the Paris Peace Accords is that the remnants of 13 divisions and 75 regiments, an estimated 100,000 plus troops, are left in South Vietnam in the ceasefire in place. So that color there, which my untrained infantry eyes would say dark pink, but I'm sure it's something else, is where the North Vietnamese troops are left. Now, they're in a much debilitated state, but they're still there. So the idea that the North Vietnamese will have to launch a new invasion is sort of laughable because they're already there. In An Loc, in some places, they're only separated by the width of a road. U.S. departure, 27 February, the last contingents of American POWs are released. Last U.S. unit, the 1st Aviation Brigade, stands down on 28 March, and on 29 March, Military Assistance Command Vietnam furls its colors and goes home. Now, that doesn't mean that the war is over. The war really never really stops. Because it's a ceasefire in place, there's a flurry of fighting before the ceasefire goes into effect, because in a ceasefire in place, you own where you sit. So there is what is known as the war of flags, as each side jockeys to plant their flag on the territory. There is an International Commission of Control, the ICCS, which was also laughably called I can't control and you fill in the S at this particular point. 2 appeals to Nixon, actually goes to California, meets with 2, as you see in the bottom picture there. And the result of that is that Nixon makes the last of 31 promises to 2 that the U.S. will honor their commitments to South Vietnam if North Vietnam launches a new offensive. At the same time, Kissinger goes back to Paris, meets with Le Duc Tho, and they sign what's known as Son of Ceasefire in June of '73. It's about as worthless as the first ceasefire in terms of its ultimate impact. Nixon, by this time, is besieged by the Watergate scandal. Congress cuts off all funds for combat action in and over Laos and Cambodia, and that means we're no longer bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, as you might suspect, what that means almost immediately is that everything that can be moved south to refurbish those units that were destroyed or damaged during the Easter Offensive, over the course of the next year will be built back up to 100% or better. Meanwhile, where our focus, at least the White House's and the Pentagon, is on the Arab-Israeli war and the subsequent oil embargo in October '73. Congress passes the War Powers Act to tie the hands of the executive branch with regard to making war, and subsequently cuts the military aid for fiscal year '74. At this particular point, Vietnam is a non-event in most American households. Meanwhile, the fighting continues with very, very little letdown. It's interesting because in the rest of '73, the ARVN acquit themselves pretty well. They're stretched thin, but they fight very well. And in fact, they chased the North Vietnamese into Cambodia in a couple of instances. It is very heavy fighting. This is the heaviest casualty count for the South Vietnamese armed forces except 1968 and 1972. So this decidedly is not a ceasefire. However, that dynamic changes by mid-'74. The U.S. aid cut begins to kick in. We have taught them to fight the way we fight, with massive expenditures of munitions, and they begin to run out of ammunition. There are also drastic shortages of ammo, fuel, and spare parts. 2 decries the situation, saying he's having to fight a poor man's war. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese army is increasing its pressure. Then the next body blow that comes is Nixon resigns on 9 August '74. And Nixon was looked upon as South Vietnam's main patron. 31 promises, we will be there. It is about this time then, having watched these events unfold, that the North Vietnamese Politburo decides it's time to launch a test case. And they want to do a couple of things here. They want to launch a corps-level, multi-division attack to see how the South Vietnamese fight. But more importantly, they want to see what the Americans are going to do. They launch an attack by the North Vietnamese Army 301st Corps on 13 December '74 at Phuoc Long, which is a town just north of An Loc, up against the Cambodian border, about 75 miles from Saigon. There are about 5,400 ARVN defenders there, and you do the math. 3 divisions outnumbers 54 ARVN defenders about 4 to 1. The outcome is pretty much predictable. 1 regiment holds out for a week, but as you can see there, only 30 men survive out of 350. The city falls on 6 January '75. The entire province is in NVA hands by early January '75. It is the first entire province in Quang Tri to fall to the North Vietnamese. The U.S. response is nil. Ford, by this time, as Phuoc Long is falling, gives his State of the Union address, does not mention the word Vietnam. A couple of days later, and I believe it was at Rice University in Houston, he is at a press conference. He says essentially, and I'm paraphrasing broadly here, I can see no reason or no instance why the United States would become involved in Southeast Asia in any way whatsoever from this point on. So by this point, the South Vietnamese are in a pretty debilitated state in terms of their materiel. Their primary patron is now in disgrace in California, or Florida, or wherever he went. And the U.S., the new president, has publicly disowned them. Now, the results for, I would also say that the North Vietnamese back in Hanoi are stunned, number one, by the South Vietnamese collapse so quickly at Phuc Long, but stunned more by the lack of a U.S. response. So the 23rd plenum is really in session when Phuc Long falls. So they make a major decision that now is the time, perhaps, to launch a bigger, larger, more extensive campaign, offensive, Campaign 275, planned by General Zung, that you see there, and the objective would be Ban Me To It in the Central Highlands. And the purpose of this campaign was to set the preconditions for final victory in 1976. So in a sense, this was a shaping operation as well. Even at this juncture, they're going to launch this offensive looking over their shoulder because they still cannot believe the United States will not respond, that the United States will let the South Vietnamese go down. The Battle of Ban Me To It in the Central Highlands takes place from 10 to 18 March, and in this particular case, once again, the South Vietnamese forces are overwhelmed fairly quickly, and yet another province, Darlac province, with the seat at Ban Me To It, falls to the North Vietnamese. It is at this juncture that Tu meets with his generals, even as Ban Me To It is falling. All along, some of his generals had said, really what we need to do is we need to shorten our lines. We need to withdraw the preponderance of our forces in to protect the population areas. Because Tu's approach was, you protect every inch of South Vietnamese territory. You give up no territory. So that meant that they spread their forces too thin, and in many cases, they had forces out protecting the monkeys in the coconut fields to no particular end. So by this time, even Tu, who cannot believe in the back of his mind that the United States will not ride to the rescue, is convinced by his generals, and this is a copy of his actual map, to shorten his lines, to trade space for time. And in this particular thing, which would be called light at the top, heavy at the bottom, there would be successive defensive lines from the north. And then ultimately draw back into the hashed mark area, the darker area, or gray area that you see there, because that was the heartland of South Vietnam. That's where the preponderance of the people and the main resources and assets were. The problem is, this makes sense. But the problem is, it's about a month and a half too late. So in order to retake Ban Me To It, the 2nd Corps commander orders a withdrawal from Pleiku and Kon Tum further north in the Central Highlands. And the idea is these forces would be pulled back to the course and then reconstituted and then go back in and retake Ban Me To It. As it happened, the people in Kon Tum and Pleiku, and these are the 2 largest cities in the Central Highlands, nor the RFPFs, the local militia, are informed that the ARVN are pulling out and what the plans are. So what happens is they wake up one morning and see the regular army pulling out to the south, and as you might suspect, they try to get in front of them. And what results is a complete debacle. Along this unimproved logging road, RTL 7, you have strung out the preponderance of the combat power from the 2nd Corps, 3 divisions plus, and all of the civilian population from Kon Tum and Pleiku. And what you see there are pictures of this highway. And this highway is really nothing more than a logging road. As you might suspect, the North Vietnamese respond quickly, send troops down from the north and up from the south and cut these folks to pieces. And as Arnold Isaacs from the Baltimore Sun said, that it appeared that a vital part had come loose. This was no longer an army. In one fell swoop, in a matter of days, 1/4 of the combat power of the South Vietnamese armed forces had either been destroyed or dissolved into the jungle. As bad as that was, what was going to happen subsequently to the north was even worse. And in this particular juncture, Tu becomes involved. He's got a very good corps commander there, arguably the best ARVN general, a fellow by the name of Trung. And Trung's in pretty good position in Quang Tri and Hue. But with the Central Highlands falling, Tu gives conflicting orders to General Trung, tells him to hold Hue, then not hold Hue, then hold Hue if he can. And the general is whipsawed back and forth over a period of about 6 days. Ultimately, he's ordered to leave Hue, pull back from Hue, and at that particular point, the South Vietnamese have pretty good positions. And this is demoralizing to the South Vietnamese forces who think they're holding out there at Hue. The other problem is they have all of their families with them. And they become more worried about evacuating their families, naturally, than they're worried about conducting combat operations. All of those forces and civilians will end up in Da Nang. Da Nang's normally about 400,000. It ends up with 2 million people, almost overnight. And this is the panic that ensues. Ships are standing in the bay off of Da Nang. People are jumping into the surf trying to get there. You can see in the upper picture there, handing their babies up to people on the boats. At this particular point, the North Vietnamese began to shell the shoreline. At this juncture, you now have lost 50% of your combat power. And what ensues is the domino theory, but the dominoes are the ARVN towns that fall subsequently, day after day, inexorably as the North Vietnamese march south. U.S. response at this particular point, Ford sends letters to Tu promising support. He sends General Nguyen, the Chief of Staff of the Army, to South Vietnam to make an on-site assessment. He comes back and says, and I forget what the figure is, but $600 million are needed just to hold what they got, not to take what they've lost. Ford goes before a joint session of Congress, and as you might suspect, it was a frosty reception. The Senate Armed Services Committee shortly thereafter voted not to approve the supplemental aid request, and the issue is dead at that point. By this time, the North Vietnamese have closed on Saigon from every direction. There is one major battle at Swan Lock outside the city, and really that holds up the North Vietnamese advance for about a week, but by 26 April, they're completely surrounded in Saigon. Tu goes on TV on 21 April, vilifies the United States, Nixon and Ford, and resigns. Grabs his suitcases full of money, gets on a plane, and goes to Guam or wherever it was. I forget now. So by 27 April, the PAVN forces, and I use NVA and PAVN here, People's Army of Vietnam, interchangeably, probably confusing to some, have surrounded Saigon. You had an acting President Hung who takes over momentarily from Tu. This guy is ill, blind, and has diabetes, so he doesn't last very long. General Dung Man Minh, and you may, if you've studied anything about Vietnam, be aware that he was a major character in the coup that overthrew Diem in 1963. It is thought that he might have some contacts in the People's Revolutionary Government, the old National Liberation Front, and that perhaps he can get a better deal for South Vietnam, but we're way past deals at this point. 29 April, the North Vietnamese begin to rocket Tan Son Air Base, and the runway is closed. In that instance, 2 Marines are killed by the rockets. Subsequently, an order is received to evacuate the White House by helicopter because you can no longer use the runways at the airport. The first CH-53s arrive at 15:06 in the afternoon. They begin to evacuate the U.S. and South Vietnamese from the embassy, the Defense Attaché compound, and other staging areas around Saigon. This is the last telegram that was sent from the embassy in Saigon. This message constitutes our last man turning out the lights. So, 30 April, it's all over. There is some fighting along Newport Bridge on the entrance to, or the approaches to Saigon, but essentially it's all over by early afternoon on 30 April. See the tanks rolling onto the grounds. This upper left there I took inside the presidential palace there, the large white building that you see. There's a picture off the wall there that someone took as the tanks were coming down the boulevard, Cong Ly Strasse. So the question is, I guess to end with here, is why did South Vietnam fall in 55 days? To my way of thinking, you certainly can draw your own opinions. The Paris Peace Accords that left the remnants of the 100,000 North Vietnamese troops in the South and a ceasefire in place was the death sentence for South Vietnam. Nixon, who had made all the promises, resigned. I don't know what he would have done had he not resigned, because he was pretty well debilitated politically, but certainly, and I don't know what of course no one can say what his intent would have been anyway. The reduction of U.S. aid to Saigon had a major impact, but it also must be recognized that the South Vietnamese and their ineptitude in Saigon and on the battlefield own a large part of the blame themselves. And then, oh, by the way, and this kind of goes back to a discussion with George Pickett about Pickett's charge, and he was asked, what did you do wrong? And I'm paraphrasing largely again, and he said, well, the Yankees might have had something to do with it. So in this case, the North Vietnamese resolute, and they were resolute throughout the war. Despite the amount of casualties that they took, they were steadfast in their objectives and held to them to the end. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that their leadership is contiguous throughout the war. The guy who's running the thing in the 60s actually remains in charge till 1986. So that sort of brings me to the end of this. I'll be happy to answer your questions if we've got any time.
Stay right here. We have two students out here, and they will come to you with the microphone, and you can respond that way.
Okay.
What kind of grade overall would you give General Westmoreland as the commander?
Could you raise your hand, please? I hate talking to. Oh, there you are. Perhaps a better grade than Bob Sorley gives him, if you've seen that recent biography, which is really not a biography, it's more like an indictment. Everybody likes to make the case between Westmoreland and Abrams, and the short answer is Abrams brilliant, Westmoreland dumb as a post, and I think that's a little bit too simplified, to say the least. I would suggest to you that if Abrams was in charge in 1965, he would have done exactly what Westmoreland did. Someone had to take care of the North Vietnamese. So this idea that there's a dichotomy between the counterinsurgency and the conventional forces is not yes or no, or either or. The answer is yes. You have to do both of them. Could Westmoreland have done something in terms of resourcing the pacification effort and the advisory effort with South Vietnamese? Sure, I think so. So it's sort of a mixed answer. But I certainly don't come down like Sorley does the subtitle is Westmoreland, the general who lost the war. I think there were a few other people involved in that effort. In the front here, please. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Dr. Willbanks, that was a riveting lecture. Thank you. Peter Arnett, a guy some people in the Army love to hate because they want to blame Vietnam on the press, made an interesting statement one time. He says, look, the North Vietnamese can infiltrate 100,000 people a year from the north. They can recruit 50,000 from the south a year. If their casualties meets that figure, they can just disengage. And because they can deny battle until they can rebuild their forces, we didn't have any viable strategy. What do you think of that proposition?
Well, I think that might be a little bit simplistic. It depends on what part of the war you're talking about. By certainly 1970 on, there's not a lot of ambivalence out in the countryside about who the good guys and the bad guys are. There wasn't an uprising in 1968. If you look at the Tet Offensive in 68, the idea of what they wanted to try to do was laughable, because the only way that made any sense is if the entire countryside rose up and joined the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and they did not do that. And consequently, I'll give you a perfect example. There was a small squad of about 10 guys who were supposed to take the radio station in Saigon, and they were told, take the radio station, hold it for 2 days, and there'll be reinforcements to join you. They held it for 2 days. They died in place. There were no reinforcements. They were never coming. So in that particular case, we like to make the North Vietnamese 10 feet tall, but they made a lot of mistakes as well. And first, I wasn't sure where you were going with your question, but I don't subscribe to the idea that the press lost the war. I don't subscribe that they were blameless either.
Okay. Are there contemporary lessons to be learned in, say, Afghanistan, Iraq, possibly Syria, or is it apples and oranges?
Well, it is apples and oranges, but it does allow you to ask some of the right questions, I think. I think in a small example might be the advisory effort in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can see some lessons that were learned in the advisory effort in South Vietnam. Now, whether we learn those lessons or not is open to conjecture, because we seem to be making some of the same mistakes. We just had that where we have the Vietnam lesson, or one of two Vietnam lessons in the class with the majors today, well, this week and last week. And as we're talking about the advisory effort with Dr. Mullis in the back, I sat in his class today, and they're making connections right and left. The synapses are firing because they've gone through the same experience. And there's a very healthy cynicism, I think, because they ask the question, well, why are we doing the same stupid things again? I hope they remember that when they get to be colonels and generals. Sir.
Thank you for coming and speaking to us today. How would you evaluate the strategic and tactical plans that we had in this period, 68 to 75, as far as their implementation? Did we have strong plans? Did they have to be modified extensively, or were the plans weak in the first place? Just speak to that general question, if you could, please.
I wasn't aware there were any. Didn't feel like it down at my level. The idea was that you the strategy was transfer the war to the South Vietnamese. And the idea was that the U.S. troops would not withdraw from that particular area until that unit, South Vietnamese unit in that area, could assume control of the area of operation. But as I said, in fact, Kissinger says about the troop withdrawal, it's like eating salty peanuts. Once you get one, you want some more. And so these things happen. They only postpone them twice of the 16 increments, and then only for a couple of days. So the idea, and there are a number of people who say, at this juncture, Nixon's more interested in getting out of Vietnam than either winning it or helping the South Vietnamese survive. The decent interval idea.
Sir, thank you for your information and knowledge. I'm sorry I missed last month's talk on the war. My father worked in Vietnam for U.S. Foreign Aid Program in 1956 to 58 for 2 years. We lived there. I went to community school in Saigon. Later on, my brother actually went off to Vietnam as a Vietnamese linguist in 1970, but he never saw any combat. I was in the Peace Corps in Senegal in the mid-'70s, and I met some French troops on maneuvers and said to them, by the way, we both lost in Vietnam. But the French guys, the French soldiers said, yeah, but we had a few helicopters and a few tanks, and you had everything, and you still lost the war. What I'd like to know, 2 years ago I went back to Saigon for the first time since then and spent a week there. The city is booming. It's a very modern town. Have you been back to Vietnam? How many times, and what do you think?
5 times.
What do you think about the situation there now?
Looks like we won. It's booming. It's superheated. I forget what the figures were, but the GNP is sort of doubling every 4, 5, 6 years. And I'm not an economist, so don't hold me to that, but I will tell you that if that is socialism, it's not what Ho Chi Minh had in mind, because everything is for sale. I first went back in 2005, and frankly, it was a little surreal because I went to where I was when I was a captain. And I didn't know what to expect, but I'm of a particular age, so a younger Vietnamese walked up and said, have you ever been here before? And I said, yeah. And he said, during the war? And I said, yeah. He said, that's great. What can I sell you? And I think the figure was somewhere between 50 and 60% of the population was born after the war. And it's the Peloponnesian Wars to them. They're more interested about the economy and their iPads and Western music, and it's a great place to visit. I was just back last January, 2011, I guess, 2011.
We have several questions. We'll take 3 more.
I'm really not very familiar with the Vietnam War, but these lectures have been really interesting. I have a question about the spread of communism into Vietnam and that fear that existed with Johnson and then Nixon, but then it fades away with Ford. What happens in that period where Ford kind of turns his back on Vietnam and it did not have that fear of communism spreading?
Well, you've had a bettering of relations, and you can put this in Nixon's basket. One of the things I think he did that was pretty well done is he opened the door to China and to the Soviet Union. And actually that is also one of the reasons that the North Vietnamese become a little bit more pliable at the end of '72, because Nixon has worked the Soviet Union and China. They're now they're the main patrons of Hanoi, and they're talking to Hanoi and saying, make a deal. We're not going to support this thing forever because it's having an impact on their economy as well.
This is a minor question. On the photograph of the general shooting the guy in the head, I've read and heard two different versions of what the guy did. What happened?
Eddie Adams, the guy that took the picture and won the Pulitzer Prize, before he died here a couple of years ago, said he wished he'd never taken the photograph. Because the picture is very evocative, and the actual video, it was on the news one time. And the video is you actually see the guy fall, the blood sprays out for about 6 feet. And what had happened there is General Lone, who was no great character himself. I mean, he wasn't pure as the driven snow. He was kind of a scoundrel. But he had caught this guy in the plaid shirt that he shoots in the rubble of one of his friends' houses where he had gone in and killed the family. And so he just summarily executed him. But that doesn't play well on the 5:30 news, because you don't get the rest of the story. Even if you buy that the rest of the story is I don't see that as a rationalization, but I do see it as a reason. If that's maybe a difference without a distinction, I don't know, or a distinction without a difference. I'll let you make that determination.
Okay. Yeah, I know there was a difference in an opinion how to approach the war between the Army and the Marines. But how did the Australians kind of view things?
The Australians were given an area pretty close to where my division was based, along the coast in the south in a province called Phuoc Tuy. And they were primarily focused, it was an area that, not much North Vietnamese, but a lot of Viet Cong, and it was an area that they transited a lot, so they did a lot of small unit stuff. They didn't have any really big battles. And they were focused on small unit patrolling and those kinds of things. They were very good at that. And they're... It's kind of interesting because I was in Australia here, I forget the year, but it was the 10th anniversary of the dedication of their Vietnam War Memorial. And they have an organization called the RSO, the Returned Servicemen's Organization. And there was a backlash against Australian Vietnam veterans, much like as there was here in the States. And in fact, Australian Vietnam veterans were not allowed to be members of the RSO. They weren't, in the beginning, they weren't recognized as real veterans. So they had a really kind of tough time there for the first couple of years. So I was there for the 10-year anniversary, and their war memorial, and they're all in one place there in Canberra. The dedication of that was, I think, very much analogous to the dedication of the wall in D.C.
Sir, you actually pointed out one thing that I was going to mention. The majority of the Vietnamese population are like me. They're too young to remember the war at all.
Right.
You know, with reinstitution of relations a dozen years ago, or I don't know exactly when, to me, it might as well have never happened. But we've started building a new relationship with Vietnam, perhaps as a counterbalance to the rise of Chinese power. How do we go forward in building that relationship, and is it important to us in the long term?
Well, I think it is. When you go there, if you ask the Vietnamese about the Chinese, they talk about the brother. They fought a war in 1979 over Cambodia, interestingly enough, when the Khmer Rouge began to push the killing fields up against the Cambodian-Vietnamese border where the ethnic Vietnamese lived and started to put them into the killing fields. The Vietnamese went across the border and occupied the country for 10 years. And at that particular juncture in 1979, the Chinese launched an attack across the northern border on a punitive expedition to punish the Vietnamese. as it turned out, the figures I see, and I'm not real sure about the veracity of them, but 25,000 casualties on both sides. And the question then becomes who got punished. It does result in a large effort within the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Army, to make itself more modern, because most of the troops they were fighting were Vietnamese militia in the north, because the main force troops were in Cambodia. And the militia held their own against this massive Chinese army. So in the years afterwards, the Chinese set about to reform itself.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you on behalf of the Dole Institute of Politics for being here this afternoon, but please join me in thanking Dr. Willbanks for an outstanding presentation this afternoon.
Thank you.